This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. Thanks everybody for being with us today. Really appreciate it. And if you're new here, because we've had quite a few new people check out the show, first off, thank you. Very appreciative of you guys taking a listen to the show. But in case you're not familiar with the show, you don't know what to expect, this is the 2023 version of a call-in show, which means that we don't get people to call us. We get emails or tweets or Instagram DMs, and we take questions from you folks, the anglers, and we do our best to answer them here on the show. So that's what the show is all about. There is a place to ask questions. I've left a link to it in the podcast description below. That'll just take you directly to a place where you can send us an email and get your questions answered directly here on the show. Now, today, we've got quite a few interesting things lined up to talk about. We're going to talk about fishing egg patterns, if it's possible to fish too deep, the White River in Arkansas, fly line, and I'm going to give you all a little bit of a story as well. So that's what we've got in front of us. So let's just dive right in to that first question. This one is brought to us John from Tennessee. He says, is it frowned upon to use egg patterns while fly fishing for trout? John, you just stepped in it big time. All right. In short, the answer to your question is no. And if someone tells you that it is, tell them to lighten up and to listen to this podcast where I will set them straight. All right. I've had the chance to write quite a bit on this subject. Actually, kidding aside, I've had the opportunity to write a lot on this. And we have an article on the Ventures Fly Co blog that goes into details about the do's and don'ts of fishing the spawn. The spawn is when fish create more little fish for us to catch in the coming years. And for brown trout and brook trout, that takes place during the fall, as well as lake trout. There are some fall spawning strains of rainbow trout as well, but then your rainbows and your cutthroat and your golden trout spawn in the springtime. So overall here, John, this is a really good question because egg patterns get a little bit of a bad rap because, well, it's not really a fly. And, well, I mean, Perdigon's not really a fly. The mop fly is not really a fly. Walt's worm is definitely not really a fly. But we use all of those patterns all the time. So I don't really think any of us have a moral high ground, so to speak, to stand from and say, thou shalt not fish eggs because it's not a fly. Well, okay, neither is the prince nymph, but we all love it, right? At least I do. And I know Alex and Berkeley, two of the other guys here at Ventures, they're not just two of the other guys, they're the head honchos. They love prince nymphs. And when I say love, I mean, it gets a little creepy sometimes, how much they love prince nymphs, all right? But the point is, it's perfectly fine to use an egg pattern. The only thing that you want to be aware of, John, is where and how you're fishing that egg pattern. Because the big thing is you don't want to be fishing to fish that are actively spawning. You just don't want to do that. If they're actively spawning, leave them alone. If they're on a red, leave them alone. Certainly don't step through those reds because then you're killing potential new generations of trout. So that's all detailed in the article, which again, I've left a link to that in the podcast description so you can go find it. But that would be the general consensus from the fly fishing industry right there is it's not frowned upon to use an egg. Just be responsible with it. It's the same as with any other style of fishing. Just be good to the fish, right? At the end of the day, I mean, hatcheries are making new fish, but they're not making new fish habitat anymore. I mean, we've got a finite amount of water, a finite amount of places where these fish can live. Let's do our best to take care of them. And John, I really appreciate that question. All right. Thank you. Now, our next question, is it possible to fish too deep, if I have too much weight on, will I be able to detect a strike with my indicator still, or will it go unnoticed? That's from Steve T. Steve, great question. All right. Short answer for you. No, it's not possible to fish, quote unquote, too deep. For those of you not watching the video podcast where you get to see my wonderfully inept beard growing skills on display, I was doing air quotes. So if you're not watching the video podcast, just imagine me doing the air quotes when I say too deep. There you go. If your flies are too deep, Steve, you'll get hung up on rocks, catch a lot of salad, and you won't be fishing anymore. Okay, you'll be snagged, but it's not possible to fish too deep, I think, in the way that you're saying. All right, so semantics aside, I think the last half of your question is what you're trying to get at. So that's what I'm going to focus on answering here for you. All right, if you have too much weight on, will you be able to detect a strike with your indicator, or will it go unnoticed? Right? Now, absolutely, if you have too much weight on with the wrong size indicator, it can cause some problems. Let me give you an example. The creek nearby my house here in Wyoming, it's all pocket water, and the pockets are pretty deep. It's a pretty deep stream, just in general. And I was out there fishing one afternoon, enjoying myself, and I had a perdigon on and a midge, and then I think I had a egg pattern on the bottom. So there I am fishing eggs, right? Fishing 3 nymphs and had an indicator on. The indicator was way too small, though. So as I'm drifting this, that indicator is supposed to sit right in the surface of the water. Not in the surface, pardon me, right on the surface. Okay, they're supposed to float right on the surface. Ideally, there's going to be very little tension on the indicator so that the minute your line moves, the indicator also moves, thus indicating to you that you have a strike and need to set the hook. So I'm sitting there, I'm watching my strike indicator, it's going down, it's bouncing, but it's like a half under the water, and I'm ticking the bottom like every 2 feet. And so it was really tough to tell, and I couldn't figure out if I was catching any fish or not because of that same issue where it was just too deep, and I couldn't tell what was going on with my flies. So I needed to switch it out to a bigger indicator, which I ended up doing. As soon as I did that, the flies were suspended the right way, but most importantly, I could see the strikes. That's what you're looking for, is being able to see the strikes on that strike indicator. That's why we call them strike indicators, I believe. That is where the name originated from. Some guy wanted a better name for bobber, apparently. So, anyways, we addressed using correct indicator size in episode 2 of this podcast, so I would suggest taking a listen to that one. You get a recap of what was said there. I go in depth. But to sum it up, you need to make sure that you're using an indicator that's large enough to support all your nymphs and any weight that you might add. Again, the reason behind that is if the rig is too heavy, it pulls the indicator slightly below the surface, and you're not going to see as many takes as you would if the indicator is riding right on the surface the way that it's supposed to. All right. You'll also have a hard time if your indicator's not floating correctly. You're going to have a hard time detecting strikes by feel, because if the fish feels a bunch of weight on the line when it goes to take your fly, they'll often spit it out before you even feel the line stop or pause. And you could feel some takes before you see them, even fishing with strike indicators, not just fishing with the Euro style of nymphing, right? You can feel those takes sometimes. The indicator doesn't move, but you know a fish took it. You felt that little tap, that very distinct, just tap, tap, tap going on. So not only are you not going to be able to detect strikes if your strike indicator is sinking too low, you're not going to be able to feel those strikes as effectively because you've got so much weight that's not properly suspended. It's just kind of dragging along the bottom. All right. So that's why it's recommended. That's why I recommend, anyways, that you fish with heavier flies first instead of adding a bunch of split shot, because the heavy flies don't inhibit you from feeling takes in the same way that split shot does. So that is, I think we nailed all your answer there, Steve. So thank you again, or nailed all of your question. I can't talk. don't know why they put me on a podcast and I trip over my words like this. I teach high school. That's my day job. And I'm always doing this to my poor students, just tripping over my words. Just it's a little bit embarrassing sometimes. But thank you, Steve, for your question. Appreciate it very much. Do you have a burning question about fly fishing and want to get the answers? Sick of wading through Google results that don't make any sense? Well, then the VFC podcast is for you. All right. We need questions. Go ahead and submit them here to the Untangled podcast, where we can take those questions, answer them on the show, and put that knowledge back into your brains that you're looking for about fly fishing. All right. So don't wade through those Google results and try to hope you're going to strike gold on a forum post from 2003. Instead, submit your questions to the VFC team and we'll answer them right here on Untangled. All right, our next question, we got a twofer. There are not many trout in Kansas, but I am close to the White River in Arkansas. Is that worth the trip and have you been there? Also, I am new to fly fishing. Is going up to the real expensive fly line worth it? I am talking like the $120 fly line. John A. from Kansas. Thanks for sending that in. Appreciate you taking the time to type that out and send it out on the interweb so that I could answer it on the show. And I know I'm sounding sarcastic, but I promise I'm not trying to be. All right. In all seriousness, thank you, John. Appreciate it. So I haven't been to the White River in Arkansas, unfortunately, but it's without a doubt worth the trip. I don't think anybody here at VFC has been to the White River, actually. Now, I have a few friends who've made the trek. They went there all the way from Utah, and they loved it. It's a very unique fishery. It really offers you a good chance at once-in-a-lifetime size brown trout. So it's definitely the place to go if you can get there. I'd go there. I mean, I live in what a lot of folks consider trout mecca here in Wyoming. I mean, it's not as much of the mecca as Montana, but I mean, Montana's cool, but Wyoming, I mean, we don't plow our roads in the winter. That's how great we are. Okay. So, as for the fly line part of your question here, John, the general consensus in fly fishing when it comes to gear is to buy the best gear you can afford, because usually best gear is the most expensive, but it's also the best. So, I know that's not really helpful. It's like, oh, buy the best you can afford. Well, gee, thanks. I want to know if $120 fly line's worth it. If I can afford it, it's worth it. Well, yeah, really, that's what it kind of comes down to. If you can afford it, I would buy it. If you can't, the cheaper, like $60, $70 line is going to do you fine. The big difference that you're going to notice is in durability. Really, that's kind of your big thing. Your big differentiator with prices in fly lines is durability, and then some of the fancier technology things that come out on the new fly lines. So it really is worth spending your money on it, though. I mean, and I do want to be careful here, though, that I want to make sure I say this. I'm not sitting here in my glass house here on the banks of the Bighorn River in Wyoming, looking down upon all you peons that don't fish bamboo or sage or Winston, and telling you that you need it. That's not what I'm doing, right? I'm certainly not sitting here saying, hey, you need to spend a bunch of money to get good gear. I'm not being that gear snob. Like I've said before, I've reviewed gear for the better part of a decade, made part of my living, really writing gear reviews for different magazines. So I know gear very well. I'm confident in being able to say this gear is good, this gear, don't spend your money on it. So I'm not sitting here trying to tell you that you need to spend a whole bunch of money to get good gear. There's a lot of great fly line that is at a reasonable price. So please don't take any of this stuff this way. Right? I'm just trying to answer the question of, is spending $120 on line worth it? I think it is, but also don't feel like your fly line's inferior unless it's falling apart on you and it doesn't float. And it's floating line. I mean, if it's sinking line and it floats, and that's a issue too. You need to call the line manufacturer. But unless your line's falling apart and doesn't float, you're probably going to be okay. All right. And there's a lot of great gear out there for a really good price. One of the best reels that I've ever owned, I got at a pawn shop for $45. All right. And I have a lot of rods that are really expensive, and I have a lot of rods that are very affordable. And so it runs the gamut. And at the end of the day, most of the stuff that's really good is gonna be a little bit more expensive. All right. That's why I think with Flyline, though, it's worth spending money. It's really important to have good Flyline. Okay, that's what we cast. You can think of our Flyline is like the lures that gear fishermen use. Okay, some of the price I spent on some of those lures. The last time I bought a Lucky Craft lure, it was like $25, and that was pre-COVID. It's probably $50 now. Now the Lucky Craft lures, they were amazing, but $50 for a lure. And then people look at us, well, you paid $120 for your fly line. Yeah, well, I cast it. Well, that's the thing. As important as the lure is to getting line out there, if you're fishing conventional style, fly line, that's what our rods cast. Our rods cast fly line. So you want the best line that you can get to maximize the best performance out of your rod, right? That's why I'm saying you probably want to go a little bit more expensive on line. It's just not a place that's worth skimping on because it's what our rods cast. It's what a fly rod casts. It's how it loads. That's how you get your flies to the fish is with fly line. All right. Now, the thing to pay attention to when you're buying fly line more than anything else is taper. The taper of the fly line, how thick it is at the head to where the head ends and joins the running line. That is what makes the difference in how your fly rod is going to cast, is if you have the right taper, the right weight line on your rod. Okay. We're going to dive into this in probably a blog. I think we're going to do a series on this on the VFC blog. But until then, I've linked a couple of resources to understanding fly lines in the podcast description. So if you don't know anything about tapers, if that sounds foreign to you, check it in the description. There'll be some information there. All right. But really, when you're buying expensive fly line, you're paying a little bit more for tapers that have been really refined to bring out the best in certain fly rods. Okay, let me give you an example. Winston sells fly line that's specifically made to cast their progressive medium fast action rods better than anything else on the market can. Now, that's why that's Winston's marketing spiel. Is that true? In my experience, yes. I own quite a few Winstons. I've fished Winston's energy line is what it's called. I've fished other lines, and the energy line, just the taper and the weight of that line is just perfect for those Winston rods. It's the same thing with any other kind of fly rod that you're going to look for. Certain lines, certain tapers are going to coax the best performance possible out of a rod than other lines and tapers. All right. So that's one thing that you're paying for. When you pay up for fly line, you're paying for the taper. You're also paying for durability. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but fly line spends a lot of time getting dirty. It's prone to cracking and breaking. Generally speaking, more expensive fly lines are also more durable, so you will replace them less often, right? I fish a lot. I'm on the water 150-ish days a year, something like that. And I replace my fly lines about every 2 to 3 years. So for the average angler who fishes a couple dozen times a year, an expensive fly line should last, around 5 years. So if you paid $125 for it, that's like spending $25 a year on fly line, which isn't too bad if you look at it that way, and it lasts 5 years. It might last longer, it might not, just depends. So to recap, buy the nicest line you can afford, but pay attention to that taper to make sure that you're buying line that brings out the absolute best performance from your fly rod. All right, so I promised everybody a story to end the show with, so that's what we're going to do. Big thanks again to everybody who went ahead and gave us questions today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. And just one more reminder, short little reminder, please, if you have a question, go ahead, click the link in the podcast description to submit a question. You can go to the Ventures Flyco blog, submit a question there in our weekly emails. If you're subscribed, you can submit questions through a link there. You can DM us. Carrier Pigeon, the Pony Express, still runs in Wyoming, so that's viable as well. Anything you can do to get us questions, we greatly appreciate it. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into story time. So, it's been brutally cold for everybody this winter. Northern Wyoming, where I live, especially so. And been even more interesting because I live right next to some mountains, so there's a lot of little mountain streams, and those streams aren't spring fed very much through their upper reaches, so they have been frozen over for about the last 2 weeks. There is no fishing those streams, no matter how badly you want to, and trust me, I have tried. So everything's frozen up, and I'm about an hour drive from the nearest tailwater. Well, that tailwater is on Native American land, and Native American lands require you to have a special license to fish them. Well, those licenses are only good for the calendar year. So if I would have bought one just to fish the end of the year, I would have been spending $155 to fish for 2 months. So I haven't been fishing in a minute because it's been so cold and everything's been frozen up, but I didn't want to spend the money on the license. Well, the calendar year turned over. It is 2023, so I went ahead and bought my tribal license and went out fishing with my buddy, and we cruised on down there. It was supposed to be a beautiful, gorgeous Wyoming day, 30 degrees. It's a practical heat wave. I was out there in my I won't tell you what I was out there in. I don't want to put that image in your heads, but it was warm. All right. It was amazing. The weather felt amazing. And we get down there to the river and we rig up, and it was a little windy. I mean, it's Wyoming, so it's going to be windy, right? Wasn't too bad. And we get down to the water, and I've never fished this river before. I've driven past it a million times, just never stopped to actually fish. So I stop, I fish, and we're on a tailwater, so it's open. I know there's fish around. I kind of have an idea what I'm going to do, and I'm just staring at the water trying to figure out, okay, where do I even cast? Because in the winter, remember, you want to be looking for kind of that slower water that still has current running through it, but it's not, the fish aren't going to be in the riffles, but they're not in the dead still pools either. They're kind of in that in-between water that's deep, slow, but has a very defined current so that they can snack on food without having to move too much. So I finally found some of that, and there's this pool right under this big rock, and my mother-in-law drives through this canyon when she comes to see us, and there's these enormous rocks in the river, and every time she drives by one of those rocks, she says, "Look at that rock! It's huge!" Just like that. She just can't get over these big rocks. And before anybody freaks out, I love my mother-in-law to death. All right. But she loves these big rocks. So I'm sitting there fishing underneath one of these big rocks. I took a selfie for her because I knew I was going to need to send her a picture of it. So I was sitting there fishing under this big rock, and the wind kicked up and the sun dipped below the mountains behind us. And it went from 30 degrees to probably about 5 degrees in about 10 minutes. Maybe not that, drastic, but it certainly felt that way because all of a sudden my waders froze up. Like I was walking around, I couldn't bend my knees because my waders were frozen from all the water on them, and fly lines frozen. It was so cold, the welded loop on my fly line broke. I've never had that happen to me before, and I fish in the winter a lot. Well, I finally get one good drift through this pool. The indicator takes a nosedive. I set the hook, thinking, maybe I got like a 10, 12-inch brown trout. Well, then the thing kind of comes up to the surface and almost jumped, kind of did that big roll thing. And it was, by the time I got it in the net, it was a 23-inch brown trout. And the wind's howling. It's so cold. I can't feel my fingers to get the fly out of this fish's mouth. I'm just trying to keep it in the water, get the fly out. I ended up just cutting the fly because I couldn't feel my fingers. I just cut the fly, but we got it back and let the fish go. and it scampered off. And then I sat there with completely numb fingers after that. The moral of this story, though, is the fish are where you expect them to be this time of year, because that fish is right where, looking at that run, I thought it was going to be. It just takes some persistence. And, one fish in however long I was out for in those kinds of conditions, I mean, that's pretty good winter fishing in my book. So it was a lot of fun. But just share that story with y'all. Just get you a little inspired to get out there and get into the fishing, even if it's cold. If you can find a tailwater or a river that's got a lot of springs feeding it, and there's enough open water and current that the fish are there, then go out there and have some fun. I mean, what's a finger if you get to catch a fish, right? Lose a few, catch a few fish. It's fine. It's a good trade as far as I'm concerned. Seriously, though, thank you, folks. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show. Please, if you have a minute, go ahead and rate the show on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening to this. Give us some feedback. Let us know what else we can do, and make sure you send those questions in. Appreciate everybody's time. Have a great one. Until next week, tight lines, everybody.